Did you ever get a chance to go to some of the toilets or parks or Stanley Parks when you were out here?
I was aware of that, but I never really seriously got into it. I did meet a couple or three guys during that winter. One in particular, a really beautiful man, actually. He was... I should preface this by saying I always have liked my guys to be woodsy. Now, that's a pretty subtle concept to define, but there has to be a look about them that they have paid their dues. They are authentic looking. They're not people who have spent 2.5 hours in front of the mirror before going out and then are propped up against a bar somewhere, posing and being theatrical about the whole thing. And this guy was a real, genuine, dyed-in-the-wool lumberman type person. And he worked at a mill somewhere in the area of Britannia Beach. And I saw him frequently over the winter. And some very, very, very good things happened. And that was my first kind of non-anonymous sexual experience. And I still remember him fondly. He was not the sharpest pencil in the box, but he was really into hugging and cuddling and just really, really human type sexuality. But nobody was too comfortable at that time. So any sort of really intense sexual relationship got very quickly problematic on account of that, because it was so hard to trust somebody else with your secrets.
So was this person also gay, or was he closeted or married, or?
No, he recognized himself as gay, but he was really butchy enough that nobody would ever suspect, which is the way he liked it, you see, and that made him a little more possibly relaxed about it.
And how did you two meet?
As I remember it, it was just a chance meeting in the street or in a coffee shop or something like that, and it just clicked. It was a question of, well, it was a little more intense than just plain gaydar. It was, I know you know, and I know you know I know, and so on. And we talked, and one thing led to another. I want to give you a couple of examples of what was happening. I told you about the headspace that came out of the Second World War. That, too, produced some very interesting things, because it had been the first time when hundreds of thousands of men had come together from all over the country in the military. I'm sure the inevitable happened, but we didn't know that then. Somebody from that era who was probably the first to stand up publicly and be counted was a guy by the name of Harry Hay, down in the Bay Area of the United States. And he actually was the first person that I know of who came out publicly and started an organization called the Mathematician Society. And that was the beginning, insofar as I'm concerned, of gay lib.
So at that point, were you aware of articles that were writing?
I mean, we were totally unaware of any of that. News of any of that had not yet reached Vancouver, let alone Regina, Saskatchewan. The other example I want to bring up for you is what would happen if you were not totally inside a closet within a closet. And that was Alan Turing, the man who laid the groundwork, the conceptual groundwork for the digital computer. He was involved in the Second World War in breaking the codes generated by the German Enigma coding machines. After the war, there was an incident in which he took someone home whom he'd met casually, and they had a sexual encounter. And it turns out that this guy robbed him, and he went to the police. The result of it being, he was charged. While he didn't actually spend time in prison, the bottom line of the whole episode is that he was the one who was found at fault, and it was a horror story. He was chemically castrated and ended up several years later in taking his own life.
Okay.
It was a feeling of total, rigid social conformity. And that essentially was what the 60s was all about. That so-called romantic movement of the hippies. These days, everybody seems to only remember it by the very superficial things, you know, the styled dress and that sort of thing, but it was a lot more involved than that. It was suddenly people decided that the emperor has no clothes, and we are sick and tired of this. Large numbers of young people got together and said, hey, it's about time it occurred to you that there are some changes that need to go down in this society to accommodate ourselves to creativity and diversity, not long hair and pipe puffing and all of that stuff. I mean, that was a relatively superficial aspect. Openness and the freedom and the ability to be whoever it is that you really are came out of that. You have to understand and to try to get an insight into what it was like to be growing up gay and know that the very fact of who you were was a criminal offense.
Do you remember hearing anything about Stonewall when it happened, or any kind of feelings when Trudeau makes, the decision to remove the state out of the bedroom?
Yeah. Oh, that was a great sense of relief. That was just the benchmark. By the time people got around, the politicians are always behind the people in terms, I mean, it was already de facto happened before the legislation actually was passed.
I'm really interested in that transition from this intense fear and paranoia of the 50s and then the opening up in the 60s, which you can see the civil rights movement being important for, but I'm just wondering how you account for that opening and why something that at one point would have terrified anyone, suddenly people decided to take the chance and go,
There were many ways of climbing that mountain. And how you got there, in my case, it was through psychedelic substances, to tell you the truth. Suddenly that gave you an insight. I mean, this whole bloody thing is a fiction. And it is possible to reinvent oneself. And this insight was happening very quickly to hundreds of thousands, almost simultaneously. And it literally was a social revolution.